Most language learners spend years studying a language with practically nothing to show for it. And that was me. I remember taking Spanish classes in 6th and 7th grade, barely passing the first one and failing the second. I was bored out of my mind, nothing stuck, and I thought that language learning just wasn't for me. A few years later, I had kind of a change of heart, and I decided to start studying again, but this time on my own. In the span of just a few months, I made more progress than I did in years of studying at school. I skipped past 2 entire grades, I got A's on all my exams, and I didn't even study for them. So if you want to learn a language so fast it feels like you're going to be arrested for grammar smuggling, then watch this video. The first technique I used to learn so quickly was something called Sutton's Law. This comes from a bank robber who, when he was asked why he robbed banks, he said he did it because that's where the money's at. And so the whole principle around this is that when you're faced with some sort of a dilemma and you're not sure what the correct answer is, it's probably the most obvious one. And this principle today is used by, for example, doctors. If you come into their office with a headache, they're not automatically going to assume that you have a brain tumor and start scanning for that, right? They probably just think that you're dehydrated or maybe stressed. And this can be applied very effectively to language learning as well. When you're learning a language, it's very easy to get caught up in the details and focus too much time on very low priority things. I mean, I know I've been guilty of watching those kinds of 10 plus ways of saying I in Japanese kinds of videos, right? Where they go over some information that, sure, it could be useful to know, but realistically, how many versions of I are you actually going to use in your day-to-day life? And so, even though you could technically be improving on your pronunciation and niche vocabulary or studying obscure grammar points, if you want to learn a language so quickly the language learning police comes knocking, your best bet is probably to do the things that are the most important and that give you the highest yield. And so the question we gotta ask ourselves is, what is the most obvious thing we can do at this current moment? And I think if we take a step back here and look at languages as a whole, what really is a language? What is it made up of? In my mind, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's just words and then ways of structuring and saying them, right? So it's pretty much vocabulary or words, it's grammar, and then it's pronunciation. But the most important things there is words, aka vocabulary, and how you tweak them to kind of change their meaning, right? Which is grammar. I think that if you're in your first 3 to 5 years of learning, I'd still call you like a semi-beginner, right? Which is the spot that I'm in still in Spanish and Japanese. And in that case, all we really gotta focus on is learning more words and more grammar. And of course, the earlier you are, the more basic stuff you're gonna be learning, but that's fundamentally the gist of it, right? Advanced people can get away with learning more about pronunciation or cultural knowledge because their understanding of grammar and vocabulary are already so high that the returns they get on learning some more niche words is not really that high. But perhaps speaking more fluently or knowing about some historical event or some kind of trends in that country could be fun for when having conversations, right? But to get to a decent level very quickly, all we really gotta focus on is basic vocabulary and basic grammar. So, to learn those things in the most effective way possible, we're gonna use something I call frequency hacking, which is all about learning smarter and not harder. Let me ask you a question. Let's imagine for a second that there are 2 aspiring MMA fighters. These people both want to get to the UFC and go pro, right? But one guy, he trains every single day, but he practices a few different martial arts. He practices a bunch of flashy spinning kicks and flying elbows, flying knees, all that kind of stuff, right? Maybe he goes to the gym, he goes on runs, he does a bit of everything. And the other person, he specifically looks at which martial arts seem to be the most common, which moves seem to be the most common, and he focuses most of his time on the basics. Who do you think will learn the quickest? In my mind, it's pretty obvious, right? It's the guy who focuses on the basics. Because even though technically it could be good to know like a flying kick or a spinning kick or whatever, the amount of times that it's actually used in is pretty low, right? So if you get really good at the basic punches, kicks, and takedowns and such first, then you'll already have a way bigger advantage than the other guy, because he's just kind of mediocre at a bunch of different things. So how you apply this to language learning is asking yourself, how can I learn multiple words in the time it usually takes me to learn one? You might have heard the statistic that the most common 1,000 words make up something like 80% of the spoken language. And that's true. And so because of that, we really don't want to be doing what most people do, which is focus on stuff like animal names or job titles right away. It's not that those things aren't important, but I swear, if you go take a language class right now, Spanish, Japanese, French class, whatever, some of the first things you're gonna learn is the name of bird or rat or otter or stuff like this. And it's like, I mean, how often are you gonna be talking about otters in real life, right? Learning the most common grammar points and vocabulary that's actually used in like everyday conversation is so much more useful than learning stuff like lawyer or secretary or random ass job titles. Of course, you will use them at some point, right? And you need to know some nouns to be able to talk about stuff. But it's way more useful to just learn stuff that can be used in multiple contexts, right? Because random nouns will just be able to be used as those nouns, right? You can't use them in any other way, and you can't use them in conjunction with anything else. How many lawyers do you meet every single day, right? How many times do you watch a YouTube video or you have a conversation with someone and you start talking about secretaries? I mean, that's very, very rare, yet that's sort of like the first thing that these apps and textbooks introduce you to. And so frequency hacking is all about focusing on the most common words and common grammar rules, which will get you conversational really, really quickly. So that means that instead of just learning very generally through apps like Duolingo or through a textbook, you want to focus on cheat codes. For me, this was using an app called Language Transfer when it came to Spanish, which I have a whole video about up here if you want to check it out. And what that did was that it taught me that tons of English words can actually go straight into Spanish when you just change the pronunciation a little bit. So words like normal become normal. And when you take normally, it becomes normalmente. And so everything that ends in ly becomes mente in Spanish. Now, if you use Duolingo, you'll never know this. Yeah, you might pick up on the pattern, but you're not gonna learn it as quickly. But if you actually take the time to look for these, there are actually tons of them in every single language. And by learning these common patterns, I kid you not, I was able to understand and produce thousands of words within just a few weeks. Now, this didn't mean that I was fluent or that I could speak them with confidence or very quickly, right? It's not that I knew thousands of words, it's just that I was able to identify them, and if I was in a conversation and I wasn't sure what something was called, I could probably sort of like translate it, right? Without much problems. And so, if you're studying a language like Japanese, let's say, or Korean or Chinese, it might be more difficult than if it's something like Spanish and you already speak English, right? Because they're very similar. But these patterns still exist. Like with katakana words in Japanese, when you don't know the patterns, it might just sound like they're kind of scuffed English, right? It sounds like English, but mispronounced in some way. But when you know these patterns, and you know that there's, for example, no V and there's no L in Japanese, then automatically it all makes sense, and you can kind of start guessing the words for yourself and producing them, right? And so, because you know that a word in Japanese can't end with a consonant unless it's N, and you also know that there's no V or no L, automatically words like hotel, they become hoteru, right? Words like video, they're not video. You could say video and they'd probably understand, right? Video. But it's video because there's no V, right? And so this exists for a lot of words, right? You might have heard oishi, ureshi. They all end in shi, and they're all sort of emotions, right? And so this is something that people don't really talk about. I mean, I was never told this when I started learning languages. I managed to find them out, which was really helpful, but if you use this, you can actually kind of cheat your way into learning tons of vocabulary without even studying them. And so, how to do this practically is by finding a good grammar resource first. I really recommend Language Transfer, but it doesn't support all languages. It mainly supports, I think, European languages like French, Spanish, Italian, German, maybe Arabic, a few languages like that. But if you're studying something Asian, like, let's say, Chinese or Korean, it does not support those. So in that case, I think the most important thing that you should do is avoid these sorts of all-in-one solutions that focus too much time on very low frequency content. What I mean by that is apps like Duolingo that just throw sentences at you like translate this, and it just give you random words, right, that you will barely ever use, or at least not in your first few months or first year. So there are quite a lot of good online grammar guides or video series or even just random textbooks or apps can work, but what you gotta make sure that you do is that you spend your time wisely. So don't obsess over certain minute kind of nuanced differences between one word and another. Just try to get the most basic rules down first. And you can also use AI to help you find patterns in that language, like what I talked about with Spanish before, or even find resources. Now, you also need a good way to learn vocabulary, and the way I recommend doing this is using a spaced repetition software like Anki or Quizlet. With these, you can either create your own deck via looking up a word frequency list, or you can just download a pre-made deck if you're learning a pretty popular language. I downloaded one for Japanese where it already had the 6,000 most common words with example sentences and pictures and all that, which is very, very helpful, right? And so an SRS will help you remind you of words so that you never forget them, essentially. And the good thing about them is that instead of it being kind of a pre-existing textbook or app, like I said, which is an all-in-one solution, you can really customize it for yourself and you can choose which words you think are worth studying. So instead of wasting your time on a bunch of random words or nouns, like I said before, you can choose to just learn the 100 or 1000 or 2000 most common words to really boost your comprehension very quickly. By doing this, you'll ensure that the words you learn are actually words you're gonna use. But unless you have the time to learn, then none of this really matters, right? So let's go over how to find time to fit language learning into your schedule. One of the biggest struggles people have with language learning is simply finding the time to do it. And if we want to learn a language so fast, UN translators put us on a watch list, we gotta find ways to maximize our time. And how we do this is in 2 steps. The first one is all about finding hidden time in our days. The way we often work or study is that we have a task, we sit down to do it for a certain period of time, then we take a break, then we get another task, sit down to do it, then we take a break, and so on. And although that works very well usually, I think it also perhaps has contributed a little bit to making us feel like smaller periods of time are where we're supposed to do nothing, right? Because if all of our classes are like an hour long and then we have a 20-minute break or 10-minute break, that makes us feel like those small moments of time aren't really worth much. And while that's true generally, I think this mindset of thinking that, oh well, what's 5 minutes gonna do anyways, is kind of harmful, because if you get 5 minutes in the morning, 10 minutes at lunch, 15 minutes later, and then you have 5 minutes at the end of the day, that's like a significant period of time when you add it up at the end of the day, right? And so, if we can maximize these small, so-called micro moments, and really fit in a little bit of learning when we have an open block of time, that can really amount to something. And so, how I did that when I started learning Spanish was that I pretty much always listened to that language transfer app that I talked about when I was walking somewhere. So when I was commuting or walking somewhere, it was always in my headphones. And when I had a break that was finishing in maybe 5 to 10 minutes, I tried to do a little bit of Anki reviews on my phone or a little bit of Duolingo. This isn't much if you look at every individual session, but if you look at them together, then you can fit in quite a lot of learning doing it this way. And another way you can fit in some extra learning without really adding too much study time is by replacing existing habits with language learning. So, for example, if you go to the gym multiple days a week, you might not want to listen to some language learning podcast or an audio course throughout that whole session, right? When you're training hard, you might really want some music. But how about when you're walking or going to the gym? When you're going back? How about when you're warming up? How about when you're doing some cardio? How about when you're out taking a walk or taking a run? There can be many periods of time where you'd normally just put on some music or not really put on anything at all, maybe when you're cooking or doing the dishes. But you can actually fit in an extra 10, 15, 20 minutes of language learning during that time. And this is even more significant when you think about stuff like, at the end of the day, you might watch some Netflix or a few YouTube videos. I understand that if you watch 2 hours on Netflix at the end of the day, or 1 hour, you might not want that whole period of time to be just Japanese study or just Spanish study, right? But if you can find some interesting Japanese or Spanish show, let's say, if that's what you're studying, and you can substitute even just like 20% of that time with that show instead, then you're still doing practically the same thing and you're not really wasting time, but you're getting a lot more practice in. This is something that you have to build up with time, because I am really sympathetic to not wanting to swap out everything in your life, right? I think some people go too extreme and they're like, oh, well, you listen to music? What? Do you listen to music and you call yourself a language learner? Like, you're supposed to just have Japanese in your ears all the time. And that's a good strategy if you're super obsessed about a language, but you might just want to be like decently good at it, and you might be new to it as well. So then it's like, yeah, you don't have to go all in, right? But trying to find these small pockets of time and small swaps that you can make to one hobby or from one hobby to another is really, really helpful. And if you want some help maximizing your time or study routine, I offer one-on-one coaching. So click the first link in the description to see if I can help. Now, the second way to maximize your time is by making every unit of time really count. So what this means is that when you do have some time, let's say you have a Saturday morning off or something like that, try to actually set aside 30, 60, 100 minutes, something like that, to actually study without distractions and be focused for an hour. Because most of us, let's face it, probably have an hour here or an hour there when we look at the week as a whole. But the mistake many of us make, me included, is having that hour, being like, oh yeah, I can study a little bit during the morning. But then we sit down and we maybe study a little bit, but then we get some notifications, and then, oh, this girl from school texted me, so let me answer that. And, oh, look, I got this notification from my friend. Oh my God, that happened. And it's like, yeah, that's fine sometimes, but when you have a limited amount of time to begin with, try to make that time actually count, right? And so pick an activity, eliminate distractions, and don't multitask. If you implement all the techniques we've talked about today, you'll be doing drive-by translations in no time. But to make sure you stay consistent with your learning, you should watch the video on screen, where I go over my honest advice to anyone who wants to learn a language. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys there, and until next time, keep learning.